This is the class, Why Four Gospels. It is the topic Parallels and Differences in Meaning, and this is video 4. And I continue my discussion on the second story of Jesus calming the sea, and in this story, walking on the water. Now, I need to point out here that John's Gospel also contains this story. And it's one of the few stories that John has in common with the other Gospels. There is no conclusion to the story in John, as we have in Mark and in Matthew. John's version is a short, brief episode, the briefest of the accounts. Jesus doesn't even rebuke the wind and the waves in John. And that may be because there are no exorcism stories in John. And when Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, the symbolism draws upon Jesus rebuking and silencing the unclean spirits that react in his presence. In John's Gospel, there are no unclean spirits. There are no exorcisms and casting out of demons and evil spirits. John's version has only one line from Jesus, where Jesus says, "It is I, do not be afraid." And that, of course, recalls the name of God by which God identified God's self to Moses. In John's Gospel, as in Mark's Gospel, the story functions as an epiphany story, as a revelatory story. But the epiphany in John is different than in Mark. In John, the revelation is about Jesus as the Word incarnate, the living Logos, the incarnate Logos, the incarnate Word. Jesus is the wisdom of God, which wisdom has always been and always will be. Jesus is viewed as the personification of that wisdom. Jesus is the self-revelation of the divine, the Word made flesh. And that's how John uses this story. Now, in one sense, Matthew uses the story in the same way that he uses the first miracle story. Namely, to proclaim Jesus as Son of God par excellence. Matthew proclaims Jesus as God's agent of redemption, who, like Moses, was raised up by God to heal and liberate God's people. Now, Matthew presents Jesus as one greater than Moses, but like Moses, Jesus acts in God's behalf to redeem his people. However, in this second story, Matthew goes beyond that. There's more to the story in the second miracle story. The disciples in this second story have a more positive response than the first. And Matthew includes the story of Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water toward Jesus. Matthew clearly uses the second story to teach a lesson in discipleship. Now, as I pointed out in my first video, Matthew concludes this second miracle story with the disciples worshiping Jesus and proclaiming him to be the Son of God. Clearly, Matthew is telling this story from a post-Easter point of view. I mean, the confession of the disciples at the conclusion of this story, where it says they worshipped him and declared, "You are truly the Son of God." That is a post-Easter confession. We imagine that confession being made in Matthew's church, in Matthew's faith community. The confession presupposes a setting where Christ has become the focus of the community's prayer and worship. So the disciples are making a post-Easter proclamation when they worship Christ and they proclaim him to be the Son of God. Now, what about Peter walking on the water, which is, of course, unique to Matthew? Mark does not have this story. In Mark, the story functions as an epiphany story, where the disciples do not grasp and understand the epiphany, the revelation about Jesus. Mark uses the story to demonstrate the spiritual ineptitude and callousness and blindness of the disciples. The very opposite the way Matthew uses the story. Matthew uses the story to teach a lesson on discipleship. So let's read what Matthew has to say about Peter. This is in Matthew 14, verses 28 and following. And this would be a good place to pause the video if you do not have your Bible open, and turn to this story and follow along. Just after Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," Matthew says, Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, a question every interpreter of Matthew has to grapple with and ask is, well, why did Matthew add this story about Peter? And I'm sure there will be different perspectives and views. In my opinion, Matthew wanted to point out that following Jesus as the Son of God in the midst of the challenges and storms of life, especially those that threaten the peace and justice of God, can be a real struggle. The forces that make for chaos and disorder, the forces that oppress and entrap people, symbolized by the wind and the waves, are powerful forces in the world. They are violent forces. Forces of coercion in the domination system of this age. And it's going to be a struggle. Discipleship to Jesus in such a hostile environment is no easy road. And Jesus says in Matthew's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, that the road that leads to life is narrow and it is difficult. I think Matthew uses this story of Peter to point out the necessity of keeping our focus on Christ when we confront and experience the terrifying and paralyzing power of evil and injustice in the world, either personally or collectively. Matthew is calling upon his community and us, the readers, to remember that the power of Christ, the power of love and nonviolence, the power of suffering and righteousness, the power very different than the world's power of violence and coercion, that the power of Christ is the power that God will use to overcome evil, and that power is available and accessible to us. You know, you come to the end of Matthew's Gospel, and what does the Christ say? "I am with you unto the end of the age." We will have to struggle with the violent power of evil and disorder in our own lives, in our own hearts, and we will have to contend with it in the systems and the structures, the institutions and organizations that we are part of. And right now in our country, we are in a struggle for justice, for people of color, and it is a tough struggle. Because there are 35 to 40% of the people in this country where the forces of racism and injustice are strong and deeply embedded in structures of power, such as our criminal justice system. The fight for justice is a difficult one, and the waves will rise, and the wind will beat against us. And like Peter, we may find ourselves overwhelmed at times by the wind and the waves. We may find ourselves paralyzed by fear, unable to move. But the Christ is there. And we need to remember that all we have to do is cry out, Lord, save me. Lord, help me. Lord, heal me. Lord, liberate me. Lord, free me. Lord, empower me. And the Christ comes to us. He reaches out his hand and he lifts us up and he gives us the strength to stay in the fight and stay on the path that leads to the justice and peace of the reign of God. Story about Peter and Matthew makes for a good sermon. In fact, I preached on this text not too long ago. And whether it was good or not is a matter of opinion. And it may differ as much as Matthew and Mark's conclusion.